Hi, I'm Carol Greenberg, and this is...
I'm Andy Greenberg, and it's good to see you. Hey, by the way, Carol,
Yes,
only
Andy.
1 month to go.
1 month to go for what?
Well, you know, it takes 9 months for someone to get pregnant, right?
Well, it doesn't take 9 months for them to get pregnant. It takes 9 months for them to give birth.
Yeah, right. It takes 9 months for them to give birth. You're right. It's been a while since she gave birth. And right now, we are in our 8th month.
Finishing up our 8 months.
Yeah, finishing up our 8th. Are you pregnant?
No, thank you.
Okay, I didn't think you were. So what are we finishing up our 8th month? Yes, our 8th month of the coronavirus, COVID-19. And of course, after 9 months, somebody becomes pregnant. And I'm sorry, they give birth. Oh, I got to go back to biology 101. Anyway, they go ahead and they give birth. And maybe it's by coincidence, maybe it's not by coincidence. But supposedly, in the 9th month, what's going to be coming out?
The vaccine.
The vaccine, the vaccination. But let me share something with you that I think is really going to be somewhat exciting. So let me go back a little bit to November 1st. And November 1st, there was a time when all of a sudden people said, you know what, things are getting better, as I think we might remember. And what happened was the shows began to open up. The theaters began to open up. And as a matter of fact, at 12:01 a.m., the Gaiety Theater opened up and the burlesque shows returned. Why?
Why? I don't know what... Okay.
Yeah, I got you now, right?
Yeah.
Why?
Like, what?
Because at the same time, restaurants began to reopen and things were beginning to fill up and things were returning to normal. And why? Because the number of deaths and the number of infections, in fact, started going down. And people said, okay, fine, it is time to reopen. And by the way, what am I talking about?
You must be talking about something that happened a long time ago, because I'm not reading about any burlesque shows opening up or anything like that.
Well, let me bring you back to 1918.
Oh,
Yes,
wow.
and what happened in 1918? They had
The Black Plague.
the 1918. They had the
the
Spanish flu.
Spanish flu. The
Now,
influenza.
let me ask you this question, okay? And I know I can answer it. Have people that you have known when you were younger, and some of them lived in the 1918s, or maybe your grandparents, if in fact they weren't immigrants from Europe or from wherever, the fact of the matter is, did anybody talk about the 1918 Spanish flu when you were younger?
No.
No.
I never heard about it. No, I never heard about it.
So does that mean that our descendants, in fact, are not going to be talking about COVID-19? In other words, your kids and grandkids? Is this thing just a blip on the radar screen? Well, let me go ahead and continue. So what happened in 1918 in a very popular city, by the way, and that is Omaha, Nebraska.
Oh, Omaha, Nebraska. Okay.
Where I was able to find some history. That why Omaha? Because, as you know, I lived there for 24 and a half years. And on November 1st, they said, you know what? That people, in fact, have taken care. They wore masks. They did social distancing. Sound familiar? And the number of cases went down. So the place opened up. Within 1 week, however, they recorded a double bump in what was going on. And on Armistice Day, on November 11th, it was almost as deadly as the past. And what they found out is, as a result of that, there were an additional 115,000 passings. So what's my point in saying this? Because there is hope. So what Carol and I are going to do today, we're going to go over some very elementary terms. I might want to add that neither Carol nor I are physicians. We never practiced medicine. We would never practice nursing or anything else related to that field. And what we're about to talk about has all been disclosed in research, and we're going to go ahead and capsulize it for you. So let me give you a couple of examples that you really won't believe, and it might help us think to ourselves, you know what, things are all not that bad. So, for example, and I'm just going to go into modern history, and then a little bit later, we are going to go into ancient history and kind of retrace some of the plagues you probably never heard of. But here's one that you did. You mentioned the Black Death.
Black Plague.
It was also known as the bubonic plague.
Yes, the bubonic plague.
And the bubonic plague lasted a long time, from 1347 to 1351.
Wow, that is a long time.
So, Carol, take a guess. In that period of time, knowing the population of the world was less than what it is today, considerably less, how many people do you think succumbed, which means passed away, as a result of the Black Plague?
100,000.
100,000. Anybody else there want to take a guess? 200
200 people?
million.
Million. 200 million?
200 million people
Wow.
passed away. A little bit later on, we're going to go into this. Now, I don't want to depress anybody, but what I want to show you is that, relatively speaking, if the vaccine does come out in the 9th month and people start to get it, that in the history of plagues, this one might not appear as bad, even though we're living through it. So we certainly have to understand that. Now, let's go back to the 1520s. In the 1520s, there was another plague or pandemic, which was known as smallpox. Carol, how many people do you think passed away as a result of smallpox?
Based on what you said before, I'm gonna go with 500,000.
500,000 people. So the word 50 is in there, right?
Right.
Right? You're right, 50.
50 million?
50 million, which is not 500,000 people.
Right.
500,000 people is 500,000.
Right.
50 million people passed away as a result of smallpox. Let's go to the Spanish flu that we just talked about in 1918. That only lasted 1 year.
Oh, really?
1 year. Just like our COVID-19 is going to last a little bit longer than 1 year, but maybe a year and a half, hopefully no more than 2. It only lasted 1 year. Carol, take a guess how many people passed away as a result of that. Come on.
3 million.
3 million. 40 to 50 million people. 40 to 50 million people. Now, let's go ahead and add this up to see where we are so far. Since the 1300s, and this is just by pandemics and viruses, which I'm going to explain a little bit later, you have 200, 256, and 40, 300 million people. And then, of course, you had 1 million from the Asian flu. You had 1 million from the Hong Kong flu. And you had only 770 from SARS. However, here's a number you're probably not aware of. Ready for this?
Yes, I'm ready.
Here we go. How many people do you think have passed away as a result of AIDS? Which, by the way, is a pandemic, believe it or not. Come on.
20 million.
Not bad.
What, really?
Yeah. 25 to 35 million people.
Wow.
So let me tell you where we are today in the United States. 13.1 million people have been infected with the current COVID-19, of which regrettably 265,000 have passed away. In the entire world, 61.9, if I can call it, 62 million people have the disease. 1.4 million, regrettably, have passed away.
This is the whole world?
This is the whole world, okay? So if you really think about it, it's a pity and a regret that 70 million people have it, but when you compare it to the 1.4 million that have passed away, and there will be more, and there'll be more in the United States also, there is a source of hope and optimism, especially when the vaccine comes out. But let's get back to something really basic. You have an illness, all right? You have a cold, you get over it. You have chronic diseases, which I'm not going to talk about right now. But then again, you've got 4 different categories of other diseases. And here they are. You have an endemic, you have an outbreak, you have an epidemic, and you have a pandemic. Did you know that there are 4 different types of classifications?
No, but I did hear, I've heard of an epidemic, I've heard of an outbreak. I think the pandemic is sort of new to me. And what was the first one?
The first one was called an endemic.
An endemic. I wasn't that familiar with that.
Okay, so this whole thing started off, by the way, as an endemic. What is an endemic? It involves the smallest scale of viral infections. It's like a disease that caters to a specific area, community, or region.
So when they said that China had it, that was the endemic.
Well, they actually limited it in the beginning to those people that frequented a certain market, right? So that was an endemic. It was very small, and in fact, it was a viral infection, which is important to say. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about what the difference is between a bacteria and a virus, so that we have a basic understanding. And it just catered at that point to a specific area. Now, it depends who you want to believe, and I'm not saying one way or the other. It could have started with a bat. Please remember that as we go a little bit through history. Or it could be a weapon that was designed by the Chinese. I don't know the answer. There are only a few that probably do, but the fact of the matter is it started out as an endemic. Then it moved on to the next phase. And the next phase is an outbreak, which means it did not limit itself to one specific area. It began to spread through the province and then throughout the country, and that was known as an outbreak. Believe it or not, I don't know if you remember this, there was an outbreak of another disease in the year 2019, specifically in Hawaii, and then it kind of moved further. I don't know if you remember this. I can't even pronounce it right. The dengue fever, Dengue, had an outbreak in Hawaii, and oddly enough, that is usually limited to Africa, Southeast Asia, or South America. Now, I don't want to bore you with the facts, so I'm not going to get really deep into all this stuff, but I think it's important to recognize. And then, of course, you have an epidemic.
An epidemic.
Epidemic is an elevated outbreak, which means that it is actively infecting more and more people to the point where it becomes difficult to control the spread. Now, many flus are called epidemics because you can control them by what? By shots. By shots and by vaccines and by forecasting in the future. And then, of course, you have the worst, which is one we're in right now, which is a pandemic. A pandemic conditions are at its gravest. An epidemic shows that there's a significant lapse on the part of a country or region to control the spread of the disease. And it goes throughout the world. Did you know all of that?
I did not. This is interesting.
So that's where the differences are. So it starts off small, and we're going to cover some of these, not all of them. I certainly don't want to depress anybody. But I think it's important for us to realize, yes, we have it bad, but my gosh, in the world in the past, it's been worse, and we are getting better at it. Now, one might say, but Andy, how did they solve the Spanish flu in 1 year, even though so many people passed away?
Yeah, that's a question.
Well, we've heard the expression herd immunity. And we're going to talk about that for a moment. So, what happened back in the 16th century when all this began to occur? They had a lot of horses and cows and chickens, and they were saving the indigenous people from a godless life. And then all of a sudden, the New World met the Old World. So the New World met the indigenous people. And when the New World met, what did they carry with them? Diseases. And I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but before the white man came to the United States, there were those that suggest there were 35 million Native Americans. Many of them were wiped out due to the conquest of the lands that they were living in. That's for a whole different topic and discussion. But others were not prepared for the diseases that the Europeans and the Puritans and the Pilgrims brought with them, and they had not yet developed the immunity to them, and they were spreaders.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
Okay? So if you look at the history of Native Americans, which was not listed here, by the way, many of them were wiped out by diseases. And that is really something interesting. So let me go back a little bit to what's known as the Black Death. So what was the Black Death? There's a lot of different ways to explain how it happened, but it basically started with fleas.
I thought it started with rats.
Well, here's what happened.
Okay.
Here's what happened. Yeah, it started with rats, okay? And some people even say it might have even started with bats, but I'm not going to get into that. So, but how did the rat spread the disease? Well,
they left their dropping,
Yeah,
and people stepped on them or inhaled them or whatever,
No. The fleas bit the rats
and bit the people.
and bit the people.
Wow.
That was part of it. Okay? And that became so massive that they could not control it whatsoever. And it became very difficult to control that virus.
But did they know that it was the rats that were causing the problem?
Not for a while.
Okay, because then the solution would have been to somehow get rid of the rats.
Yeah, they didn't know that whatsoever. And I'm going to tell you a little story about how a curse in London actually got solved by lemon skins. How did they get solved on lemon skins? There was such a thing later on. I don't want to skip around too much. But there was something called the London Plague. And the London Plague was spread by rats. And a lot of people regrettably died as a result of that. But what they found out was, which is very interesting, people in those days began to eat lemons. And what they did is they took the lemon peels and threw them out into the sewers. Unbeknownst to them, the rats ate the lemon peels and did not like them whatsoever. And as a result of that, many of them passed away because their indigestion couldn't hold it. And they claim that lemons stop the further passing along and the growth of the London Plague. I'm jumping around,
Yeah,
and I apologize for that, but you kind of brought it up, and I want to put a lot into this. So, what's the difference between a bacteria and a virus? Do you have any idea?
I think one somebody can catch from you, and one someone can't.
Okay, I think they're pretty both spreadable. Well, actually, you're right to a point. So, here's what a bacteria is. A bacteria is a cellular creature that you can easily see under a microscope. They were among the first life forms to appear on Earth, and they are made basically of cataplasm, and if anybody knows how to pronounce it better, please tell me. The cytoplasm, there it is. And it is a clear jelly-like fluid that houses all the biochemical reactions to keep it alive. That is the basic thing. Guess what? They live everywhere.
Yeah, I know. We all have bacteria.
They live everywhere. You have 10 times more bacteria cells inside of you than your own cells. Is that a bad thing?
No. Sometimes there's good bacteria.
80% of all the bacteria that you have is good. And how do bacteria grow? It's known as asexual, which means they just grow by themselves and they split apart, which is really a good thing to have, okay? So there are millions and millions of these bacteria. Most of them are pretty good. And the way they grow, it's called binary fission. I'm not going to get more involved into that. Viruses are different. Viruses do not spread by growing themselves. There must be a host, one person, when it first starts, oddly enough, and then it begins to find another host and spreads and spreads and spreads, which is what we have right now. So those are the two basic differences. I don't want to bore you with technical things, but as we go through some of these and we talk about hope and how immunity works and why vaccines work, and herd immunity. So what happens to our body? Some of us might know this. We have white blood cells, we have T blood cells, okay? And what happens to the white blood cells, we have in our system called immunity. And we become, thank God, immune to bad things. Sometimes we need outside help because the body has not yet been subjected to some of these new viruses or new bacteria. So what an injection usually is, or a vaccine, it is either a live culture of the disease you're trying to fight or a dead culture of the disease you're trying to fight. And again, I am not a doctor, scientist, or anything else. This is just basic research that are written in books that just about anybody can get to, but I think it's pretty important. So what happens is the body begins to build up an immunity, sees an invader come in, and attacks it based on what it's been through and based on the fact that we came with this system. But on things like COVID-19 or some of the other flus, because flus mutate so often, we've always got to update the vaccine. You get the live culture, or as I mentioned before, a dead culture, and then it helps solve the disease. So that is what vaccines and immunity does. And T cells, they do something very interesting. T cells go after the disease that comes in and hopefully gets them to solve. Carol, have I overcomplicated? Because I'm trying to keep
No,
it
I think
simple.
you're fine. One thing comes to my mind which gives me a chuckle is they say sometimes that germaholics that stay too clean won't be able to fight off the bacteria
Mm-hmm.
because they are not letting their body protect them.
Yes.
So sometimes it's okay to not be a germophobic.
Right. Exactly. So let me go over something else with you because I want to talk again about the Black Plague. So the bubonic plague was spread a lot of different ways. We talked about fleas biting, but the other interesting thing about it was, oddly enough, and this is not going to be a religious presentation, the Jews were persecuted and rounded up, put into rooms, and killed. Why? Because they thought that the Jews were responsible for setting up this whole Black Plague by putting poisons down wells and having the water being drank by all the Europeans who were not Jewish, and then therefore reducing the Christian population in Europe and therefore increasing the percentage of Jews. Now, that obviously turned out not to be true. The other thing that perplexed people is that Jews didn't seem to be as affected as anybody else in those days, excuse me, in terms of passing. They lived longer. And what they determined afterwards is they lived longer for two reasons. Number one, most of them were Orthodox, and before an Orthodox Jew eats, what do?
They wash their hands.
Therefore reducing the spread of the disease. And, believe it or not, this is going to sound kind of weird, that on the Sabbath, they were supposed to bathe. Now, one could say they only bathed once a week. Well, I'm not going to get into that. But at least once a week, I'll say it that way, they bathed, and that helped them. So because the Jews were living longer, and some say twice as long.
That's why they got the blame.
That's why they got the blame. And the other thing that was very interesting, in that half the babies that were born in that period of time, they, in fact, half of them passed away before the age of 5, and not the Jewish babies. So let me go back to something. We're talking about vaccines. Do you know when the first vaccine came out, Carol, for what disease it was fighting?
I do not.
Believe it or not, smallpox. But it wasn't in the 1500s. It was well after. It was the 1700s. Because
So that's almost
200 years later.
Yeah.
So even though smallpox was reduced in the number of people it killed and infected, the fact of the matter is it was still ongoing. So some of us might remember this from elementary school or from junior high school. But vaccines, as I mentioned earlier, include invaders that are quite alive, and then the body begins to build up an immune system to it. The first one that was ever done was a fellow by the name of Edward Jenner. And Edward Jenner thought he was on the right track because he developed a process called variolation, and he inoculated patients with bits of smallpox scabs or pus. Can you imagine being injected with pus? That's pretty interesting. And later on, they realized that it was working, and then there was a lady by the name of Lady Mary Mortley Montagu, and she was the wife of the British ambassador, and she was stricken with the disease in 1715. And then what she did is she took a nutshell full of matter of the best smallpox and put it in her veins. And once she put it in her veins, she put it on the head of a needle, and all of a sudden things became better for her, and the disease was largely gone. Other people did the same exact thing, and that was done. However, she noticed something else, which was really interesting. Listen to this. You talk about crazy things. You'll really like this. She noticed that during the smallpox outbreaks, which is why I said outbreaks before, because they were limited, milkmaids were not affected.
Okay, so something had to do with them milking the cows and getting milk on their hands, or drinking the milk, or something was in the milk.
She didn't even, we don't rehearse this stuff. He believed that it had to do with the exposure to cowpox.
Cowpox?
Yes, a type of pox erupted on cow udders. the milkmaid's hands would get cowpox blisters, which were irritating but far less dangerous than smallpox. The blisters eventually went away without leading to agonized death. So he inoculated a lady in 1796 with cowpox, and in the healthy boy, about 8 years old, for the purposes of seeing what happened. Jenner scrapped pus from a cowpox pulsate located in the hand of the milkmaid, and what happened? He noticed that the young boy did not have an outbreak, and he was immunized from smallpox and cowpox.
I'm sorry, but I have one question. Who
Yeah.
gave permission for an 8-year-old boy to be treated? Boy, that's something else.
I'm not going to answer that question.
Okay.
I don't know. And then, of course, in 1928, they had the most magnificent all-purpose vaccine that was developed. Anybody know who did what vaccine I'm talking about?
What year?
1928. Penicillin.
Aha, penicillin.
Penicillin. Yes. Penicillin. And penicillin was known as an antibiotic, which we certainly have a lot of these days. And of course, it went after the bad type of bacteria, like strep throat and staph infections and many other diseases.
And I don't know if it's widely used. I mean, I don't know if they widely use that much of it today because we've built up so much immunity to antibiotics that it may not even work.
Ah, very good. Because I was going to get to that later. Now
Okay.
you're going to make me skip around.
No,
See,
don't
we
skip around.
always have to keep on top of it because, and I don't know how this happens. There's people that are smarter and more educated than me. But how these little viruses who don't even talk to each other, or bacteria who don't even talk to each other, really viruses, how they know that they have to mutate into something else entirely because vaccines have been eradicating them in my lifetime, I will never figure out. But the penicillin, and I think many people might know this, was invented in 1928 by a Scottish scientist by the name of Alexander, anybody know? Fleming. Some of you might know that. And he worked with bacteria called, and I can't pronounce this, Staphylococcus. I can't pronounce it. And he left the lab to go on vacation and didn't clean up as well as he should have. Now, you know me, when I go on vacation, this place is spotless, right?
Spotless.
You betcha. This is lucky because when he came back, he noticed bits of mold growing on the sample. The mold killed the bacteria, and that is what penicillin is.
Mold?
Yes.
Oh, I just learned something. Mold?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So what occurred was, oddly enough, he duplicated something that ancient doctors used to use. I'm going to go back into the ancient times because they knew mold, in fact, cured some diseases.
But mold also invigorates some diseases. People get sick from inhaling mold.
It's different.
Okay.
I get it. I'm not a doctor. I don't know
All right.
this stuff. So they used to put mold on bread years ago. I mean, I'm talking way back when. I'm going to cover this in a moment. But just to set you up for it, to get rid and eradicate of some diseases. And by the way, in modern times, when a virus says, okay, they discovered something, these humans, that's where they turn into super bugs. All right. Let me go into ancient times, like I promised I
go
would.
into ancient times.
By the way, how are we doing so far?
We're doing very good. There's lots of information. Very interesting.
Is it appropriate for
It's
what?
appropriate.
Okay, all right. Now, you know her well enough that if it wasn't, she would tell me. Okay, not after this is over, but during the time. She'd poke me in the knee, she'd pinch me, she'd give me an eye. So you've seen her. This is true. All right, let's go way back when. Carol,
Yes.
today women live longer than men.
Yes.
All right. Yeah. However, in ancient times, and this is non-biblical, it's very important I say this. This is non-biblical. Between 3.3 million years ago and 10,000 years ago, men lived longer than women.
Because they did less work.
Did you expect that? I mean, did you really expect that?
Like, what's the reason?
Anyway, the reason was they would die during childbirth, they would have more infections, they would have more blood clots, and sometimes the baby was born too large to go through the birth canal.
Oh, okay.
Not very good.
No.
And you know as well as I do, and I just thought of something, which I think of these things as I go along. Doctors today will tell you that women have a tendency to complain more and men don't complain as much. Well, maybe it's because
They didn't complain.
they didn't complain and the DNA is still in there. So I thought you might want to go through that. Now, if you want to know, by the way back when, how long people lived, I don't want to scare you too much, men lived for only 25 to 40 years.
Wow.
That was it. And can you imagine when your midlife crisis was at age 20?
No.
And you collected Social Security at probably 35?
No.
I'm just telling you that the actual way it was. But what they found out is that during, and I can't pronounce these things, during the Paleolithic times, people would move from place to place. And they would move from Asia, what we now call Asia, Russia, Europe, and at the end, they actually moved to the Americas, which is why you have the Native Americans that hardly anybody talks about. But what happened? Every time they moved, there was a new climate. And the new climate saw new predators and new viruses and bacteria.
It really is starting to make sense.
Yeah.
It is. I would have never thought of it that way, but it is. And that's why too, if you associate traveling, people say that sometimes you get sick when you travel because the water might be different, the air might be different, your system is not used to all the things that you're normally used to.
I don't know about you, but when I used to travel to Asia years ago on vacation, and I heard about traveling to Africa, didn't you have to go to a doctor and get shots and prove when you landed you got certain shots?
Yes.
Because diseases were located in those particular areas?
Yes.
And by the way, if they're located in those particular areas, you remember what they would be called?
No.
Endemics.
Endemics.
That's
okay.
right. See how all this comes together? I'm glad you're paying attention. So, what would happen in the old days if somebody got sick?
Nothing.
No,
What do you mean?
they had doctors.
All right.
Yes, they had knives and needles made of bones, complete with an eye for a thread of animal sinew to do what? To do the stitches. Ah, you didn't even know that. And they had pharmacies way back when. Herbs were discovered
Yeah.
in caves in what is today known as Kurdistan, and they even had certain medicines. Watch this. You probably don't know this. So they had something to treat diarrhea or to treat constipation. And what was it? Mushrooms. I don't know if that's still being used today. I have no idea.
No, but there's a lot of herbs that are still being used today that can
Yep.
control a lot of things. Herbs for sleepiness or for this and that.
That's
oh,
right.
Yeah.
And they also had physicians. And care to guess when the first recognized physician was alive? This will really be interesting. Just care to guess.
No, you guess.
In the year 2600 and we'll say 2600
Okay, 26
BCE,
BCE.
before the Common Era, 5,000 years ago. And you know how you always hear about the Hippocratic Oath? Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah.
The Hippocratic Oath. You know who that's named after?
Who?
Dr. Hippocrates.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not making that up. I don't make these things up. You know that. Not only did they practice the medicine that I was talking to you about, they also did it with what's known as spells. Spells. Now, you might think, oh, that's crazy. But please remember, back in Native Americans, this is how it all comes together. Watch this. We're all familiar with the medicine.
Yeah.
Medicine what?
Medicine man.
Medicine man.
Yeah, the chief medicine man who runs around. Woo!
Well, we don't want to make fun of it.
No, we don't. But they do have a lot of herb common methods. Yeah.
Yeah. So what they did for stitching bones, they had band-aids, they had splints, they treated infections with honey, and if you were bleeding, yes? And if you were bleeding, they put raw meat where you were bleeding on.
And you know what? They use honey a lot. They use honey to try to suppress cough and honey to keep the tickle in your throat.
Yep. So if there's anybody out there who's a doctor, you know this. For those that are not doctors, you're not. So you've heard of the Hippocratic Oath. But do you know what it is?
It's to do the best you can for a patient, something like that.
I thought you might be interested. Here it is. I swear by Apollo the physician. By the way, Apollo was Greek, right? I swear by Apollo the physician and Asphilis and Hygikia, I can't pronounce these, and Panacea, and all the gods and goddesses as my witness, that according to my ability and judgment, I will keep this oath and this covenant to teach them this art. Ready for this? Without fee or covenant.
Wow. So they would practice medicine without charging?
Yep.
But
And
that's not the case today.
I know that's not the case today.
Okay.
Well, let's move on. And they also did the following. You know how your doctor tells you eat healthy?
Yes.
Yeah, what do you think that came from?
I don't know. You're going to tell me him?
Right here. I will use these dietary regimens which will benefit my patients, and I will do no harm or injustice to them. By the way, the dietary could also be referred to pharmaceuticals like we talked about. I will neither give a deadly drug to anyone, which means they knew what drug was deadly, and ask for it, who asked for it, nor will I make a suggestion to this effect. Now, there's a lot of ways to read into that.
Like they wouldn't give them unnecessary drugs?
Yeah, or euthanasia. Similarly, I will not give a woman,
What?
an abortive remedy. Hi, you didn't know that.
No.
I will not use the knife. Whenever houses I visit, which means they made house calls, I will remain free. Watch this. I will remain free of sexual relations with both female and male persons. What I see or hear in the course of treatment, I will keep to myself. What do we call that today?
Confidentiality.
We call it HIPAA. I will fulfill this oath and do not violate it, so to enjoy life and not violate it. And that was the Hippocratic Oath.
I never knew what
There
all
is
that was.
Hippocratic Oath.
Interesting.
Yep. And by the way, in those days, they also did tooth extractions. Oh, man, I hate to say this. I want you to imagine, and nobody should have to go through this, prostate removal. 4,000 years ago, prostate removal. They did catheterization. They did intestinal obstructions. They did abscess draining. And all of that goes back thousands of years ago. And there was at that time, by the way, I need to add, when the oath came out and this Hippocrates doctor came, that's when they first began to believe that diseases were not caused by God's rage. So I'm going to pause for a moment. I've been doing a lot of babbling. Give me your reaction so far so we can kind of like take a break before I get into something.
So interesting. It's so interesting how everything evolved. It's so interesting to see sometimes that when a disease happened, it took them a long time to develop it. It was really interesting to find out that the penicillin was discovered by accident, which a lot of things are. And I guess when they go to trial today, it really is trial and error. Mm-hmm. That's the only way that you can figure out something. But it's really important to know about the body to figure out what it can do and what it can't do.
Yep.
But I wanted to get something. You know, we talked about that we're going into our ninth month, and in the ninth month, a woman usually gives birth, and while she's pregnant, there's that anticipation of giving birth. Well, it's the same way with the vaccine. We're going into our ninth month. Eventually, we're going to get the vaccine, and it's an anticipation of hope. Let us get the vaccine. So they're both kind of related.
Very good. All right, let's talk about Chinese medicine for a while. So I heard somebody, I think you mentioned this to me the other day when somebody told you on Facebook, you can tell me what the source was, that you can't cure disease, but you have to take care of the mental first.
You have to be in a good mental place
right.
in order to be in a good physical place.
Right.
That comes first because your mind can control everything else. And yes, your physical might need some help with the medicines and stuff, but if you don't have it here first, you're not going to get it second.
Here we go. So what did the Chinese believe in? I think you've heard of these expressions. The yin and the
Yang.
The yang. Yep. And one other thing which I'll cover. The yin and the yang. So what is the yin and the yang? The yin corresponds to darkness, cold, and femininity. Huh. Women are dark and cold? I always thought of you as warm and hot. I don't know about that. While in its counterpart, yang was associated with light, warmth, and masculinity. Determining the root of an illness meant checking what? The balance of yin and yang. And if it was out of balance, there was a possibility that that was the cause of the disease. And by the way, the Greeks had something called the four humors, not jokes, but they also had a methodology similar to that, which we might talk about a little bit later. So, they also believed in something called the Qi, Q-I. It's the only time I've seen a Q without a U. Q-I, okay, what is that? It means that a person could have a blockage somewhere, not necessarily a heart blockage, I don't want to alert you. And how would you prevent a blockage? Through?
Meditation.
Nope.
What?
Acupuncture.
Which
is why they stuck needles in you. Go ahead.
I've had acupuncture. Okay.
All right. So, now I will get to the Greek humor. The Greek humor, not a joke, said that diseases were caused, or health I should say, was caused by the balance of four liquids within the body. Ready? Here we go. Black bile, yellow bile.
Green bile?
No.
Okay.
You, in your own way, you might be right. Blood and phlegm. And phlegm maybe it's what you meant, okay? Those have to be in balance. What do they mean? Watch this. They thought they were also the four basics of the world. Earth, air, fire, and water.
Earth, wind, fire, and air.
And, no. Earth,
no?
Earth, air. I'm sorry. Earth, thank you. Earth, air, fire, and water. So that's the way that they did it until the old days, okay? And by the way, watch how this all comes together. Hippocrates and Galen, who came up with the idea of the humors, ruled medical thought until the 20th century, when antibiotics proved to be a better treatment than bleeding a patient.
Oh, that was the thing, the cup they used to use.
Right.
Okay. The leeches.
The leeches. Exactly right. All right, let me go back into some other stuff now. We'll talk about history. Did you know that there was a plague of Athens?
Athens?
Athens.
No.
Oh my gosh, there was a plague of Athens. And the plague of Athens, and this goes way, 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 way back. When? 460 and 400 BCE. And I'll give you a brief thing. There was a war between the folks in Athens and the Spartans. And as a result of that, there were naval battles. And the naval battles brought diseases. And the plague in those days, this is a big number, killed between 75,000 and 100,000 people. And by the way, it came in two waves. The first wave back in, as I mentioned the year earlier, and then the second wave in 429 BCE. And it wiped out 33% of the population in those days. So we are not living through the only plague that was around. And since it only was in Athens, and here's where those definitions come in, was it an outbreak, an endemic, an epidemic, or a pandemic?
It was contained.
It was pretty much contained,
Endemic.
but I would say an outbreak,
Outbreak?
quite frankly. Yep. And listen to this. You won't believe this. The earliest plague doctors and family members who tended the ill were among the most vulnerable. So what does that mean? The first responders.
People who took care of other people.
Yep. Now, watch this. The lucky enough to survive the plague developed an immunity and became the main caretakers of those who later fell ill. And by the way, that plague for a while stopped the war. Why? Because the Spartans did not want to invade Athens when they realized that there was a plague there. So that's something you probably never know. Now, never knew. Years later, they realized that what they really had was smallpox. And there are some people that will also suggest that it was typhoid, but so far that wins. Now, there was another plague you never heard of. The plague of Justinian. Justinin. Now, watch this. Watch this. You'll be shocked. Not about the year, but about the potential cause. Ready for this?
Yeah.
It happened in 536 and 600 CE, which means a common era. And here's what it says. A global cooling period.
You mean the weather got colder?
Climate change.
Climate change.
The weather got cooler in the world. At the same time, there was a volcanic eruption. And that volcanic eruption and the cooler weather was responsible for that plague of Justinian to occur. Why did they call it the plague of Justinian? Because he was the emperor of Rome at the time. And that was occurring then. No plague occurred, now we're going to come up to modern time, excuse me, after the plague of Justinian up until the Black Plague. Now, where did the Black Plague start? Anybody want to take a guess? Who were these fleas and these rats? Where did it start?
In Europe?
No.
No.
Nice guess. Ha ha.
What?
Nope. China.
China.
Woo, there's a common denominator here. Many of our modern day, and I'll consider smallpox for a moment modern day just for the sake of discussion, started in China. And the diseases and the rats and the fleas and all that kind of stuff, because fleas don't know borders, they don't talk different languages. Yep.
Okay, is that because they always have these open air markets with the meat hanging and things like that?
Good possibility. Yep. And yes. That's exactly what it caused it as part of that. The fleas and going from there to humans and biting and all this kind of stuff. And by the way, when fleas have something like viruses that they don't like, they vomit it and it goes on other people. This is a whole kind of crazy thing. But there was such a thing called the Silk Road, and there was trade from China going to Europe.
Know the Silk Road.
And that is what was thought to have brought the plague over there. In case you didn't know that. So, how are we doing so far?
Good.
Good. There was a lot of things in here that I absolutely never knew of. And let's move on. I'm going to skip a couple things that I was going to bring in, but you know what? Maybe sometime in the future we'll get to it. 40%, by the way, you talk about poverty, and the same thing holds true today. And this is really indicative of society in general. I mentioned earlier about the Black Plague. I realize I'm going back and forth, and I apologize. But in the Black Plague, 40% of the people at that time, and remember how many people got wiped out, lived under the poverty line, and 30% were at the poverty line, which means 70% of the population. And by the way, in addition to the Jews, which has nothing to do with what I'm about to say, because I don't want to suggest that the Jews were wealthy at the time. I don't know if they were or weren't, but the ones that had a better chance of survival were who?
The people who had money.
The wealthy. And I hate to say this, but if you take a look at the facts of COVID-19,
same thing is happening.
Same thing is happening. We don't talk about it much, but if you really dig into the numbers, the exact same thing is happening. So let's kind of catch up. The bubonic plague was the worst plague in history, and they claim it wiped out, and you don't have the exact numbers, between a minimum of 30 to a maximum of 60 of the world's population. And I think I mentioned to you it started out in ports in Asia, in China, where the Black Death boarded ships, and then it was generally brought on from rats to humans. And what occurred was the uninfected flea bites an infected rat. It ingests the rat's blood and bacteria. The slime that covers the bacteria causes a backup between now the flea's esophagus. Just a little small flea, by the way, and gut, and he vomits it. Sorry?
This. It's not even this.
Yep. So, there was also a big plague of London. And I had mentioned to you about how one plague, I believe I said Paris.
Yeah, you did, with the lemon.
With the lemons, so that was solved. Then you have the yellow fever. I know I'm starting to get a little bit lengthy here, but just bear with me, I'm coming to an end. Then we had the yellow fever. And the yellow fever came from Africa when slaves were brought over and they were ill. Why do I bring up the yellow fever? Because what did we have recently? Ebola. And where did Ebola come from?
Africa.
Africa. And believe it or not, guess what animal it came from in Africa?
You're going to tell me a bat.
Aha! A bat. That's exactly where it came from. It came from a bat that spread. Now, by the way, was the bat's name Ebola?
Was it?
No.
No.
It was named after a river in Africa, the disease, because that's where the bats in that particular case had lived. And it was kind of like a far out river because they didn't want to affect tourism or make people scared. So they went ahead and called it Ebola for that reason. And what happened was it spread into monkeys, and then from monkeys into humans, and then it came over. But it was not all as bad because we were able to solve it very, very, very quickly. And by the way, there are 3 or 4 different ways to spread Ebola. I'm bringing this up for a reason. And here it is. One can spread Ebola through body fluids, okay, clothing, handling infected food, or male semen. How about that?
How about that?
All right. So we covered a lot of what happened in the past. We covered a lot of what we're looking at today. And the last one I want to cover very quickly, which still has no cure, but also had social consequences, and that is HIV/AIDS. HIV/AIDS, as we know, started in Africa. It started with an animal once again. It started with monkeys, we believe, that spread to humans. I think we all know the story. If not, it's very well published, so I'm certainly not going to go over that. But here's the other impact that it had, and that is the gay community. Because the gay community had to come out of the closet as more and more were becoming infected, including one of the original ones, Rock Hudson, as well as many others. So this one not only had social bearing, but I bet you didn't know that 35 million people have passed as a result of HIV. There is no vaccine for HIV. There are therapeutics which will lengthen a person's life. Some say an average of 10 years. When you have averages, some is more and some is less. So the whole purpose of doing this is to show you that we are living through COVID-19. As compared to many other plagues, there were a lot of things that were absolutely worse. It doesn't mean that we should accept this. But when the vaccine comes out, and looks like from what I just read the other day, there are about 30 different candidates. Not every one is going to be as effective as the other, but there is hope. Imagine for a moment when people were passing from the London plague, the Paris plague, the Athens plague, the plague of Justinian, and what have you. Did they have the up-to-date information that we have today that hope it's on its way? No. That relief it's on its way? No. That vaccines are on its way? No. They had absolutely none of that. We do. What we also have is something that they don't. And that is, if they knew of somebody that passed away, or all the sorrows or troubles that they went through, that was just a small thing. Today we see it on TV. We personalize, as we should, every passing, which makes us more worried and more concerned. So we should continue to stay healthy. We should continue to wash our hands. We should continue to maintain social distancing. We should remember what happened in 1918 in Omaha and other cities, by the way. I just picked on Omaha when we became too lax. I think we're seeing that today. If we go back to the way we were originally guided, then this thing will go away a lot quicker. So, Carol, any questions?
No, it's really overwhelming, but I'm happy to know, like you said, that there are many options out there for a vaccine to be brought to us, and we should continue our social distancing and wearing our mask and following the guidelines and keep an optimistic view that this will go away.
All right. I hope you enjoyed this. We're going to come back, as we do, with additional insights Many of them a lot more positive, but I felt it important to do this one. I hope you felt the same way. My name is Andy Greenberg.
And I'm Carol.
And stay safe and stay healthy. We will look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.